Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. So today I'm going to talk about a very trending and a very important topic for all of the ISB aspirants these days, which is how to clear ISB interviews and what essentially is uh, the flow of the ISB interview conversation. What happens, who takes the interviews, what is the duration, will I be asked anything beyond my application, will there be technical questions. So people have a lot of doubts and some notions as well about the whole interview process for ISB. So I'll cover all of that in today's video, so please ensure that you stick till the end. In terms of uh, the whole construct, first, let's talk about that. The interview is typically offline. You will be called to a hotel in your city. Let's say you're in Delhi right now. So you will be asked to interview in, let's say, Taj or Maurya's or somewhere else. Or the interviews can happen virtually, which was a result of the COVID era. But typically, it will happen offline. In terms of the timelines of an interview invite, let's say we completed our round one deadlines on September 10th. The school will notify you by the end of September, which is 21 days hence, 3 weeks hence, on whether you have been shortlisted or not. And once you get that email, then you will have broadly 7-8 days to prepare, right? Let's say Sarthak is interviewing with the school and he has gotten a shortlist and he's notified on 30th September that his interviews, let's say, on 6th October, right? So that's the amount of time that you have. So I recommend all my mentees who I'm mentoring for ISB to start preparing early, right? Because 6 days is not a sufficient time to prepare for everything and finalize your content and do mock interviews. So that's the timeline, which is last week of September is when you get the calls for round one, then broadly 7 days to prepare. Interview happens offline in a hotel. And in terms of who takes the interview is always taken by alumni of the school. Typically, you have two panelists who are interviewing you, three also sometimes, but two for sure. And typically, they are alums who have had a similar background like you. Let's say you have been working as a consultant with Deloitte for the last 3 years, and now you're applying with ISB. You have an interview shortlist. You will typically see that the alums who are taking the interview, two of them are coming from a management consulting background, right? So, just to give an example. Now, in terms of how much time it takes to uh, attend the interview, the duration of the interview, it's typically 35-40 minutes. It can be shorter also, but please don't think that if I had a 20-minute conversation, then I'm not getting through. That doesn't mean anything. So, duration is never a proxy of anything, it's never a proxy of you having an interesting or an uninteresting candidature. I have had mentees who have had 1 hour long interviews, but they could not get through. And I have had mentees who have had 20-minute long interviews and they got through, right? So typically 35-40 minutes is what I've seen and experienced. So that's the construct, right? Which is 40 minutes long, 2 to 3 alums. It's offline in a hotel, and you are intimated of the shortlist and the dates 7 days before the interview date and the interview day. Now it comes to the second part, which is what essentially forms a part of the ISB interview. Now it's a very broad question, so I'll try to break it down. In terms of the kind of questions that you're asked, they will not ask you technical questions, right? So a lot of us have this misconception from our IM interview days that they'll ask me general knowledge questions or questions regarding what I studied in college. That's not the case unless you bring it up in your conversation. So what I'm trying to say is that ISB interviews are always candidate led. The interviewers don't have a separate set of questions for you when they're meeting you. They might throw a bait at you, which is the first question, which typically is tell me something about yourself, right? But after that, their follow up questions are largely a function of what you're telling to them in your answers, right? So let's say I ask you, tell me something about yourself, and then you say I worked with Deloitte for the last 3 years, and I have before that completed my BBA. I have had my venture as well, and I've, let's say, been a placement cell coordinator as well in my college. Now I can Pick any of these things, which is deep dive on Deloitte, or talk to me about what did you do in the placement cell, or talk to me about your venture, what was the business model, why did you leave it, right? So any of the components which I highlight in my first answer can be a second or a third question in the ISB interview. Now, these are intro questions, which is tell me about yourself, your work. Then you have another set of questions, which is situational questions, right? So here they ask you questions around tell me about something that you're really proud of, or tell me about a professional failure. And that's something that draws from the second essay as well that you wrote, which is talk to me about the failure, which was a very significant failure for you, and what did you learn from it. And then they can ask you questions like tell me about a situation where you've had a conflict with a colleague or a client or a subordinate, and how did you deal with it. If you are an experienced professional, then they can ask you tell me a situation where your caliber as a leader was tested, and what did you learn from it. So situational questions are questions where the interviewee has to remember an anecdote from their work or personal life and elaborate that, and then they can ask you follow-up questions also. That's the second set of questions. The third set of questions, which form the part of an ISB interview, is MBA centric questions. Now, MBA centric questions simply mean they'll ask you questions like why ISB, why MBA, and questions like why an MBA right now? What if ISB does not happen in this year? And these are MBA centric questions. And then they'll definitely ask you goal centric questions also, which is the fourth type, which simply means what are your short term and long term goals after ISB? If it's consulting, then why consulting? How will your short term goal help you in your long term goal? What if you get into ISB but don't achieve your short term goal? What will you do? What is your plan B? Stuff like that. And barring that, questions can also be around nuances of your essays. If let's say you've talked about a hobby, or if you've talked about volunteering at length in your first essay, or if you've talked about your parents' influence on you in the first essay, which is, an honest portrayal of yourself, they can definitely pick up an excerpt and they can ask you questions around it, right? Barring that, to be very honest with you, since the essays have changed this year, I think they will definitely park 4 or 5 minutes to talk to you about your weakness, which you've highlighted in the first essay. And they'll ask you questions like, how exactly are you working on your weakness right now? Right? That's a tricky question. So I'll recommend you to please prepare a thorough answer for that. And the second tricky question from the essays can be, why exactly do you think you failed, right? And if you were posed a similar situation, let's say in ISB, how will you deal with it, right? So I think that broadly covers 80-85% of the questions that they can ask you. But trust me, these are some suggestive questions. Once you give them an answer, be it for an internship or a venture or a college club or anything, they'll definitely hear very, very carefully and ask you follow-ups on that if they are not satisfied, right? And before you go, just one thing, people assume that ISB interviews are easy. That's not the case. From the last 2 admission cycles, what I've been hearing from my mentees is that interviewers also try to grill you, right? If they're not convinced with your why ISB or why MBA answer, they try to stop you in between and they try to lawyer you. They try to play a devil's advocate, and they're not convinced, just to see how you react. So it's very important to start preparing early. And if you want me to create another video on how to prepare and how to ace the ISB interviews, please let me know in the comments. I'll be more than happy to do that. Thank you.